Frank Jones's footsteps echoed through the narrow corridor, each step heavier than the last as he approached the courtroom. His breath was steady but labored, as if he were drawing on an invisible reserve of strength to face the inevitable. Beside him, his daughter, Lily Jones, walked in silence, her tiny hand gripping his with a force that betrayed her fear. The stark contrast between them was undeniable. Frank, a man burdened by the weight of the world, and Lily, a small girl with wide, innocent eyes, struggling to grasp the gravity of the moment. As they reached the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, they swung open to reveal a cold, impersonal hall. The murmur of conversation died down as every eye turned toward them, curiosity and judgment evident in their gazes. Frank could feel their scrutiny pressing against him like an unbearable weight, but he kept his head high. Lily, on the other hand, darted nervous glances around the room, confusion etched on her young face. "Daddy, why is everyone looking at us like that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. Frank hesitated before answering, the words caught in his throat. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Just stay by my side." They moved to the defendant's area, and Frank adjusted his shirt collar, a futile attempt to ease his discomfort. Across the room, the prosecutor sat calmly, methodically arranging his papers with an unsettling confidence. There was something in his demeanor that sent a chill through Frank, something that made it clear he already knew how this would end. A hush fell over the room as Judge Thomas Reynolds entered, his imposing figure commanding immediate attention. He settled into his place on the bench, his piercing gaze landing on Frank like a blade cutting through the air. With every passing second, the tension in the room thickened. Lily clung to her father's arm, eyes darting between him and the judge. "Daddy, is that man mad at you?" she asked softly. Frank mustered a half-hearted smile, meant to reassure her, but it failed even to convince himself. The judge's gavel struck the bench, the sharp sound slicing through the silence. "This court is now in session. Everyone take your seats." His voice rang out, authoritative and final. Frank shifted in his chair, the weight of the moment settling deep in his bones. Lily, ever observant, watched intently, her small fingers tightening around her teddy bear. The prosecutor cleared his throat and adjusted the microphone before him. His eyes flickered toward Frank, lingering just long enough to send a silent message, one of certainty, of triumph. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, unwavering. "This case is as clear as day. Frank Jones was caught driving under the influence, recklessly endangering lives. The prosecution will present irrefutable evidence." His words rang through the courtroom with practiced conviction, every gesture precise, every inflection deliberate. Frank swallowed hard, his gaze dropping momentarily to Lily, who was clutching her bear, even tighter now. Across the room, Judge Reynolds nodded along to the prosecutor's words, his rigid posture exuding disapproval. His eyes, cold and unyielding, rarely left Frank. "Daddy, the judge doesn't like you," Lily whispered, her small voice laced with worry. Frank sighed and stroked her hair gently, trying to mask his growing unease. "Just listen, sweetheart. Everything will be fine," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, he was beginning to doubt if those words held any truth. When it was finally time for the defense to speak, the contrast in treatment was undeniable. Frank's lawyer stood, his frustration evident as he attempted to counter the prosecution's claims. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the breathalyzer test may have been compromised. We request." Judge Reynolds cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Proceed with something relevant, counselor. This court has no time for unfounded theories." His tone was sharp, almost humiliating. Frank lowered his head, feeling the sting of the dismissal, while Lily's brows furrowed in confusion. "Daddy, why is he treating your lawyer like that? Isn't he supposed to be fair?" she asked, her voice small but insistent. Frank hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't shatter her innocence. "It's complicated, sweetheart," he murmured. "Some things aren't as simple as they should be." But Lily, perceptive beyond her years, already sensed that something was terribly wrong. As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented a carefully curated series of evidence. Photographs, charts, and testimonies, all designed to paint Frank as guilty beyond doubt. The judge listened attentively, nodding at strategic moments, reinforcing the weight of the accusations. When the defense attempted to challenge inconsistencies, the judge cut them off once more. "We have already reviewed this. No further delays," he declared, his tone brooking no argument. Frank felt a cold sweat break out along his spine. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the trial was slipping beyond his grasp. Lily, watching it all unfold, tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, why won't they listen to your side?" she whispered, her voice tinged with outrage far beyond her years. Frank forced a smile, though his hands trembled. "They will, sweetheart, eventually," but the words felt hollow. With every approving nod the judge gave the prosecutor, Frank's hope dwindled. The prosecutor smirked, his confidence growing with each ruling in his favor. "This man chose to ignore the law, to put lives at risk," he declared, turning to the jury with a dramatic flourish. "Can a child truly trust someone like that?" Frank clenched his fists under the table. He felt Lily stiffen beside him. She looked up at her father, no longer just scared. Now, she was angry. The weight of injustice pressed down on her small frame, and something inside her burned. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, eyes locked onto Frank. "Mr. Jones, do you really believe we can ignore what has been presented here? Or do you think this court is blind?" His words dripped with condescension. Frank opened his mouth, but his voice came out weak. "I just want for everything to be evaluated fairly." The judge scoffed. "Fairness, Mr. Jones, is exactly what we are striving for, despite your choices." His words landed like a hammer blow, stripping Frank of the last remnants of dignity he had left. Lily's grip on his hand tightened. "Daddy, why are they talking to you like that?" "You're not bad," she whispered, her voice trembling. Frank squeezed her hand, unable to find the words to reassure her. How could he explain what he himself did not understand? The courtroom felt smaller, the walls closing in. Every ruling was another blow, every word another accusation. Lily, despite her young age, sensed the contempt woven into every exchange. Then, something inside her snapped. She shot up from her seat, her small frame trembling with uncontainable fury. "You can't treat my dad like that," she shouted, her young voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. The entire courtroom froze. Judge Reynolds frowned, his surprise quickly morphing into irritation. "Sit down, young lady. This is not the time for interruptions." But Lily stood her ground, chin lifted defiantly. "My dad is not a criminal. He's a good person. Why won't you even try to listen to him?" Frank's breath caught. He reached for her, trying to pull her back down. "Lily, please," he whispered, his voice strained. The judge slammed his gavel. "This is a courtroom, not a playground. Sit down immediately, or you will be removed." Tears welled in Lily's eyes, but her voice remained firm. "You can't do that. My dad has the right to be heard." Murmurs spread through the spectators, some exchanging glances of admiration at the child's courage. The prosecutor and judge exchanged a look, an unspoken challenge passing between them. Frank finally managed to pull Lily back into her seat, his hands shaking. His heart swelled with conflicting emotions, fear, worry, and pride. She had spoken the words he had never dared to say. And though the trial continued, something had changed. The air was charged with an undeniable shift. Lily's defiance would not be forgotten. Trembling with frustration, he clenched his fists, struggling to contain the wave of helplessness threatening to consume him. Across the room, the defense attorney fought to remain composed despite the relentless interruptions. "Your Honor, I asked for just a few more minutes so that we may present new considerations," he pleaded. "Denied." The judge interjected immediately, his voice echoing with undeniable authority. "This court is ready to move forward." Lily sat in silence, but inside her mind was racing. Every word from the judge felt wrong, unjust. She turned to her father, searching his face for reassurance, but instead, she found the quiet acceptance of a man who had already lost. "Daddy, he can't do this, can he? They have to hear the truth." she whispered, her voice urgent. Frank sighed deeply, then leaned down to meet her gaze. I know, sweetheart. I know. But sometimes things aren't fair. His sincerity cut deeper than any words of comfort could have soothed. Lily didn't respond, but the determination in her eyes made it clear. She wasn't ready to accept this. The defense attorney tried again. If we cannot reassess the evidence, Your Honor, at the very least, allow us to hear the witness who was previously overlooked. There is someone who can confirm that Mr. Jones was not over the legal limit. His voice carried an urgency that bordered on desperation, hoping this time the judge would relent. The response came like a final blow. There is no need to prolong this case. Additional testimony will not be accepted. We are ready to proceed with closing arguments. The gavel struck the bench, sealing the decision. The prosecutor discreetly hid a victorious smirk while Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world collapse onto him. Lily's gaze remained fixed on her father. Her small eyes shimmered with indignation. They're wrong, Daddy. They don't even want to hear what's right. Her voice was low but thick with emotion. Frank opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. Instead, he reached out, stroking her hair, a small gesture meant to shield her from the injustice unraveling around them. But Lily was no longer just a passive child in this moment. Something deep inside her burned like fire, something she could no longer ignore. She knew she had to do something bigger than anything she had ever done before. The judge shuffled his papers, preparing to close the trial. The defense attorney sat in defeat, while the prosecutor remained poised, awaiting the final verdict with an air of imminent victory. The courtroom felt suffocating, the air heavy with resignation. Frank lowered his head, feeling crushed beneath the weight of it all. But Lily did not. Her grip tightened around her teddy bear until her fingers turned white, her breaths coming quicker. She could not just sit there. Something had to change, and she was ready to do whatever it took. Then, breaking the thick silence of the room, she stood. The sudden movement drew every gaze toward her. Her face was serious, far beyond her years, and her eyes burned with an overwhelming, undeniable resolve. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and faced the judge directly. Her voice, young but unwavering, rang through the courtroom with unexpected power. You're a judge, not God. At first, her words trembled, but they quickly gained a strength far greater than her small frame could contain. Every pair of eyes locked onto her, stunned. You can't convict my dad unfairly just because you don't like him. That's not what a judge is supposed to do. The room felt heavier, as if her words carried a weight no one had been prepared to bear. Frank sat frozen, staring at his daughter, as if seeing her for the first time. Judge Thomas Reynolds, so used to maintaining absolute control, sat completely still, his eyes fixed on the girl before him. For the first time, his expression revealed something unfamiliar: shock. Lily stepped closer. Her voice did not waver. You're not even trying to be fair. You listen to what the prosecutor says and ignore everything my dad's lawyer tries to tell you. She swallowed hard but pressed on. My dad isn't perfect, but he's good. He's the man who teaches me right from wrong. And I know, her voice cracked, but she did not stop. I know he didn't do anything bad enough to deserve this. You think you can decide everything just because you sit up there, she said, her voice rising. But you're wrong. Justice isn't supposed to work like this. Her words sliced through the courtroom like a blade. Some spectators exchanged glances. Others sat with their mouths slightly open. The prosecutor, once so confident, shifted uneasily, rifling through his papers as if searching for something, anything, to hold on to. Frank's defense attorney watched Lily with something between admiration and disbelief, as though this child had just spoken a truth that years of legal experience had never allowed him to articulate so clearly. You're supposed to listen, to think, to decide with your heart and the truth, Lily continued, now standing closer to the judge's bench. But what are you doing? You're ignoring evidence and treating my dad like he was guilty from the start. That's not justice. That's wrong. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not cry. This was not sadness. It was pure, unfiltered indignation. The judge opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Lily as though she had struck him with something stronger than any legal argument ever could. His grip on his gavel tightened, as if it might somehow restore his authority. But it didn't, because at that moment Lily had taken over the courtroom. "I know I'm just a kid," she said, her voice quieting but never losing its strength. "And I know you probably think what I say doesn't matter. But I see what's happening here. I see how unfair you're being. And if you keep acting like this, then you're not a real judge." She let the words settle, then delivered the final blow. "Because a real judge does what's right. Even when it's hard." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the creaking of chairs broke the stillness. Judge Reynolds stared at Lily, his expression unreadable. For the first time in his long career, he was speechless. Frank, tears glistening in his eyes, could do nothing but watch his daughter. This small girl, who had just stood against the most powerful man in the room and shattered the walls of injustice with nothing but the truth. The judge lowered his gaze. His rigid posture seemed to falter, as if Lily had cracked something inside him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a deep breath. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. In light of the new evidence, and considering the testimony provided, he hesitated, then exhaled. "This court declares Frank Jones not guilty." For a moment, no one moved. Then, Lily let out a loud breath and threw her arms around her father. "I knew it, Daddy. I knew they'd listen." Frank held her tightly, his emotions finally breaking free. "Thank you, sweetheart. You saved me." As murmurs of admiration rippled through the courtroom, Judge Reynolds sat still, his hands gripping the edges of his bench. He looked at Lily one last time before rising and gathering his papers in silence. No further words were needed. Frank and Lily walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, freer. And for the first time in a long time, justice had truly been served. Trembling with frustration, he clenched his fists, trying to contain the wave of helplessness threatening to consume him. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney struggled to remain composed despite the constant interruptions. "Your Honor, I asked for just a few more minutes so that we may present new considerations," he pleaded. "Denied." The judge interrupted immediately, his voice echoing with unquestionable authority. "This court is ready to move forward." Lily watched in silence, but her mind was racing. Every word from the judge felt wrong, unfair. She turned to her father and saw the defeat settling in his eyes. "Daddy, he can't do this, can he? They have to hear the truth," she whispered urgently. Frank sighed, leaning down to meet her gaze. "I know, sweetheart," he murmured, "but sometimes things aren't fair." The sincerity in his voice stung more than any words of comfort could have soothed. Lily remained silent, but the determination in her eyes made it clear. She wasn't ready to accept this. Meanwhile, the defense attorney made one last attempt. "If we cannot reassess the evidence, Your Honor, at the very least, allow us to hear a witness who was previously overlooked. There is someone who can confirm that Mr. Jones was not over the legal limit." His voice carried an urgency that bordered on desperation, hoping against hope that this time, the judge would concede. But the response came like a final blow. "There is no need to prolong this case. Additional testimony will not be accepted. We are ready to proceed with closing arguments." The sound of the gavel striking the bench was like a sentence being sealed. The prosecutor discreetly hid a victorious smirk while Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world collapse upon him. Lily looked at her father, her small eyes glistening with indignation. "They're wrong, Daddy. They don't even want to hear what's right," she muttered, her voice low but filled with emotion. Frank opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply reached out, stroking her hair, as if that small gesture could shield her from the injustice surrounding them. But Lily was no longer just a passive child in this situation. Something inside her burned like fire, something she couldn't ignore. She knew she had to do something, something bigger than anything she had ever done before. As Judge Thomas Reynolds prepared to close the trial, the air in the courtroom thickened with a suffocating tension. Frank sat in his chair, defeated, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an unbearable burden. But beside him, Lily clutched her teddy bear tightly, her fingers turning white. Her heart pounded like a drum. Then, without warning, she stood. The sudden movement shattered the silence, drawing every eye to her. Her face was serious, far beyond her years. Determination burned in her gaze, overwhelming in its intensity. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't hesitate. She simply stepped forward and faced the judge directly. Her voice, though small, rang through the courtroom with unexpected force. "You're a judge, not God." A hushed murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor stiffened. The defense attorney held his breath, and the judge's gavel hovered in the air, momentarily forgotten. "You can't convict my dad unfairly just because you don't like him," Lily continued, her voice trembling at first but quickly gaining strength. "That's not what a judge is supposed to do." Her words crashed into the room like thunder, silencing even the quietest whispers. For the first time, Judge Reynolds sat completely still, his expression revealing something no one had ever seen before: shock. Lily took another step forward, her voice unwavering now. "You're not even trying to be fair. You just listen to what the prosecutor says and ignore everything my dad's lawyer tries to tell you." She swallowed hard but pressed on. "My dad isn't perfect, but he's good. He teaches me what's right and wrong, and I know he didn't do anything bad enough to be treated like this. You think you can decide everything just because you sit up there, but you're wrong. Justice isn't supposed to work like this." Her words were raw, direct, each one slicing through the heavy air in the courtroom. Spectators exchanged glances. Some watched her with their mouths slightly open. The prosecutor, once so confident, suddenly shifted uncomfortably, fumbling through his papers. The defense attorney looked at Lily with a mix of shock and admiration. In just a few sentences, this little girl had managed to say what he, with all his years of experience, had never been able to express so clearly. "You're supposed to listen," she continued, stepping even closer to the judge's bench. "To think, to decide with your heart and the truth. But what are you doing? You're ignoring the evidence and treating my dad like he was guilty from the start. That's not justice. That's wrong." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to cry. It was pure, unfiltered indignation pouring out in every word. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but found nothing. His posture, once rigid and unyielding, faltered. His grip on the gavel tightened, as if it could somehow restore his authority. But in that moment, he had none. Lily had taken over the courtroom. "I know I'm just a kid," Lily said, her voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "And I know you probably think what I say doesn't matter. But I see what's happening here. I see how unfair you're being. And if you keep acting like this, then you're not a real judge." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Because a real judge does what's right, even when it's hard, even when everyone expects something else." A heavy silence followed. Not even the creak of a chair broke the stillness. Judge Reynolds simply stared at Lily, his eyes stripped of their usual confidence. He tried again to speak, but his voice failed him. For the first time in his long career, he was speechless. And for the first time, he questioned himself.